It all began with 2 letters and 1 marriage promise. The first letter was placed on the Baron's table, the second on the altar. The promise concerned the fate of the heirs and peace on earth, where swords were accustomed to speak first. When the ink dried, the Queen already knew that she would win not by force, but by patience, knowledge of people, and faithful consistency of steps. Hello, friends. Please tell me where you are watching this video from. Write about it in the comments. I'm really interested, and I'll be happy to read it. I hope you enjoy listening. Eleanor woke up early and loved the silence before dawn. At that hour, she could hear the kitchen, the servants, the stable boys, and the bucket falling into the well. She believed that order could be seen in the little things, and that order maintained power. She told the manager that she wanted to know the movement of grain in the barns, how the duties were going, where the salt was being held up, and which monastery the extra candles had gone to. The manager nodded and promised that everything would be on the table by lunchtime. She knew it wouldn't be, and so she learned to see through the eyes of those who were overlooked. A young woman named Alice worked in the laundry. She was considered simple because her hands were cracked and her dress always smelled of lye. Alice knew how to count balls of wool, knew the price of a piece of cloth, and could tell a real seal from a cast by the way the ribbon broke under her fingers. No one asked her to do this. She just saw and remembered. Alice once noticed that the ribbon on a baron's letters had become thicker and the beeswax more brittle. She told the storekeeper that someone had bought up some of the wax from the monastery and was mixing it with tallow. The storekeeper dismissed her concerns. Alice said nothing, but noted it as a cause for concern. Martin served as a messenger in the stable. He had thin shoulders, perpetual bruises on his knees, and an old, scarred horse that everyone called stubborn. People laughed at him, saying he rode like a peasant, but held the reins like a boy. Martin rarely responded, but he knew the fords where the water pulled hooves down, and the paths through the marsh sedges where even an experienced knight would get stuck in the mud. He watched the wind and understood when the smoke from the glass workshop changed color. He saw that the sacks passing through the mountain passes were not the ones listed in the customs duties, and silently noted in his memory which haystack in the baron's yard was burning too evenly, as if resin were hidden inside. A young copyist named Hugo lived at the court. He wore a simple robe, although he had not taken monastic vows, and so he was called either a student or a subordinate scribe. Hugo was quiet and always held his pen over the parchment, as if listening to it. His mentor said that this young man had a rare ear for words. He could guess where a phrase concealed a threat and where it concealed a request. Eleanor entrusted him with sorting letters from barons because they liked to write at length, obscuring the meaning with flattery. Hugo once said that 3 letters from different people contained the same comparison, and even the same mistake, as if they had been written by the same person. Eleanor nodded and asked him to set these letters aside. On the first day of autumn, a chest of fabrics arrived at the castle. It was sent by a relative of the baron's who had long sought to marry one of the queen's daughters. The chest did not look like anything special. It smelled of fresh wood and resin, and the lid bore the usual workshop mark. The chest was placed in the chambers, next to another one, the one that was to be sent to the allies with the dowry. The treasurer kept the keys to both. She loved order and asked that no one touch the chest until she returned. But at dawn, when the water was being changed in the laundry room, Alice noticed a faint smell of bitter grass coming from under the lid of the new chest. She knew this smell from the tincture used to treat the groom's wounds. This herb could kill if sealed in a needle case or woven into wool. Alice went to Martin and asked him to look at the hinges. Martin said the hinges were new, but there was a thin insert hidden in one of the rings. He pulled it out with the tip of a knife and realized it was a hollow bone. Inside the bone was a needle. Martin said it was a trap to wound anyone who tried to open it without a key. They called a doctor. The doctor said the needle was made of bone and soaked in black grass. They carried the chest into the yard and opened it through the cloth. Everything inside was as it should be: fabric, cords, a belt, and a small bundle of embroidery needles. The doctor said that the fabric was clean, but the bundle was strange. The threads were covered with oil that did not absorb water. He ordered everything to be put out in the sun and wind to air out. The treasurer returned and said angrily that she had not told anyone to touch the chest. Eleanor listened to everyone and ordered another box to be brought, the one that was supposed to go to the allies. She asked Alice to touch the ribbons on both chests and say whether they were the same. Alice said no. The wax on the ribbons was different, and the seal impressions were similar only in pattern, but not in depth. Hugo added that the signature on the accompanying letter with the chest of fabrics looked as if it had been written by a hand trying to copy someone else's handwriting. He noted an incorrect curl and a joined letter. Eleanor thanked everyone and instructed the treasurer to draw up an inventory. The treasurer was offended, but did as she was told. On the same day, a letter arrived from the barons demanding that the queen give certain lands to the son of one of them as a guarantee of peace. They wrote that they loved order and did not want turmoil, but without a guarantee, they saw no assurance. Hugo read the letter and said that these people were not talking about order, but about their fear of losing influence. Eleanor told the steward that an invitation to a council should be sent in response. The steward replied that the barons would come with their retinues and exert pressure with their numbers. Eleanor said that her relatives, the church, and the cities would also come to the council. She understood that if the council became a marketplace of shouting, everything would collapse. She needed order and time. At night, Martin took his horse to the backyard and rode to the river ford. He had a small bag made of rough leather, which contained only 2 items: a narrow map of the coastline, on which he himself had marked the depth, and a wooden board with a nail driven into it. He threw the board into the water and watched as it was carried away by the current. He knew that if the board reached the far bank faster, it meant that enemy boats had approached and the water had changed its course. The board drifted away too quickly. Martin returned to the castle and told the chief guard that there were boats on the river and they were not carrying peasants. The chief guard laughed and said that the river changed with the seasons. At dawn, they found traces near the lair that should not have been there, iron-shod heels on the soft shore. Eleanor ordered the guards at the warehouse to be doubled. In the morning, a man in gray came to the monastery to see the bursar, called himself a candle merchant, and offered cheap wax. The bursar ordered everything to be taken to a side cell. Alice went to help because she had a habit of pitching in wherever extra hands were needed. She picked up a candle and sniffed it. It smelled not of honey, but of fat. The bursar said that was to be expected, because wax was scarce in winter, and fat was cheaper. Alice silently ran her finger along the wick and saw that it was covered with a fine powder. She remembered the needle from the chest and realized that the candles could not be allowed into the chapel. The steward said she was imagining things. She asked Martin to bring a simple candle from the castle, from the storeroom where the old spare candles were kept. They placed both candles in the sun. The old candle dripped evenly, while the new one had a cloudy coating around the wick. The steward went to the abbess and told her what had happened. The abbess ordered that the candles not be allowed in the church, and that the queen be informed. The merchant had disappeared by evening. The council was scheduled for mid-autumn. A week before it, 2 more letters arrived. One was short and dry. It said that the barons were ready to talk if the queen did not bring her forces, and limited herself to her retinue. The other letter was long and serious, as if the person who wrote it was anxious for his soul. It explained that one of the barons had a man in his service who kept all the scribes on a short leash, and that any letters could be read. Hugo read the letter and said that the author was hiding his tracks behind excessive imagery, but his hand trembled when he wrote his name. He showed how the letters shifted. Eleanor ordered a reply, saying that she would bring a church judge and representatives of the cities to the council, and that her letters were protected by a seal and prayer. She knew that prayer did not protect against knives and bribery, but something had to be said. At that moment, a man in an expensive cloak arrived at the court. He introduced himself as a merchant from a city on the river, and said he was ready to give a loan on the Queen's word of honor without collateral. He said he loved order in trade and wanted peace, and peace for him meant roads without robbery. The steward was cautious about this and said that merchants always demand double profits. The man replied that his profit was the future market, and that he was willing to cover the cost of hired guards if the Queen gave the cities rights that would make them more independent. Eleanor said that decisions on rights had to be brought before the council, but in a private letter to the merchant she wrote that she would accept his help and give the cities the right to elect elders. He was an unexpected benefactor, and he came not with a sword, but with scales. On the eve of the council, Hugo disappeared for half a day. He was found in an old tower, where he sat next to a closed door and stared at the stairs. He said he couldn't get out because there was a rope under the door, hooked on a peg. Someone had left it there so that a person would trip, fall, and drop what they were carrying. Hugo was carrying a bundle of letters that were supposed to go to the cities. He said he didn't fall because he heard the peg creak when the wind tugged at the rope. The creak sounded unnatural. He sat down on the step and stayed there until nightfall. He was found by accident. Eleanor ordered the guards to search all the passages in the towers and collect all the ropes that were not marked as household items. When Hugo came to, he brought the queen a small tuft of wool. He said he found it at the door and that it was wool as fine as the blankets made in only one place, at the workshop of the baron's wife, who demanded the highest collateral. Eleanor said that the wool could have stuck to anyone, but she noted in her memory who had entered the tower yesterday and who had left. She knew that this baron kept a man who mixed wax with tallow, loved fat candles, and always complained that monasteries were too rich. On the day of departure for the council, Martin was stopped at the gate by two men who asked to see his bag. He said that the bag contained only bread and a spare horseshoe. The men became rude and grabbed him by the shoulder. One of them punched him in the stomach. Martin doubled over, but did not drop the bag. He was rescued by a groom who was leading horses to the watering place. He said that these were the baron's messengers and that they had already broken the locks on the chests. The chief guard, the same one who had laughed at the board on the water, said he would put them in the dungeon. But Eleanor ordered them to keep quiet and release the men after writing down their names. She knew that noise was food for the crowd, and she needed to maintain a conciliatory appearance until the council. The road to the council was long and cold. Martin led the carts along the shore, where the wind whistled as if someone were pulling a string. He knew how to go toward noise and how to lead people away from it. He left one cart behind and hid the most important letters in it. He left the main wagon empty, except for a blanket and a bundle of neutral scrolls. They tried to search this wagon the whole way. He smiled and nodded, then went off on a trail where only he could stay in the saddle. In the morning, they thought he was a boy, but by evening, they asked him to show them the way. The council began on the day when the leaves began to fall with a light rain and no wind. The barons arrived with their retinues. Extra benches were set up in the church. The cities sent their elders, and the monastery sent its abbess and bursar. The merchant in an expensive cloak sat aside, did not interfere, and only listened. Eleanor announced that she had gathered the land by grain, salt, candles, and letters. She spoke simply, without pomp. She said that she saw how in some places foreign power was accumulating too quickly, and that this power did not serve the crown or the world. She reminded everyone that the world was held together by three things: law, marriage, and bread. Law is when a judge does not take rent from those who are in court. Marriage is when families unite not for profit, but for the sake of future children. Bread is when there is enough for everyone in winter. She said she was ready to give her daughter to a man who would strengthen the trade route from the sea to the mountains, thereby weakening dependence on the baron who wanted collateral. She said that the letters from the cities lying on the table asked for the right to choose elders and judge according to the charter, not according to whim. She added that the monastery was asking for the candle trade to be checked, because the wax was strange this year, and that one chest of fabrics had arrived with a trap. There was an uproar in the hall. The baron said that this was slander, and that the queen was humiliating the nobles. The abbess said that the monastery was not on the side of the barons or the queen, but on the side of peace, and that anyone who brought a candle with a dirty wick to church was working for darkness. At that moment, Hugo stepped forward and asked to read the letter. He said that the letter was close to his heart, and that he was afraid to show it, because it concerned him personally. He read that the author of the letter identified himself as a man connected to the house of a certain baron, and that he was the son of that baron, but born out of wedlock. He said that this house blamed its fears on others, while itself interfering with the wax, writing letters under other people's names, and persuading people to put poison in needles. He admitted that he himself had written for these people, imitating other people's handwriting, and now he was going to stop doing so. Hugo said that he was the author of this letter. There was silence in the hall. The baron, whom this concerned, turned pale. He said he knew only his legitimate children, but the abbess said she remembered a woman who came many years ago with a baby and a gold buckle. She said then that the child belonged to the baron's house and left the buckle in the monastery. The abbess ordered someone to bring the chest where forgotten things were kept. In the chest, they found a carved buckle with the family crest on it. Hugo took a leather strap from around his neck and showed a small sign that his mother had given him before she died. The sign matched the crest. It was a hidden kinship that no one had expected, and it struck not the queen, but the baron. The baron whispered that he did not recognize the kinship, but the abbess said that the church kept the truth, even if it was not loved. The merchant in the cloak remained silent. The towns whispered, and someone in the ranks of the guards quietly crossed themselves. Eleanor did not press the issue. She said that she did not need to humiliate the baron, but needed peace, and that peace included truth. She repeated that she was giving her daughter to a family that would open the way, and that there was still a place for the baron if he renounced the required pledge and accepted the common rules. She offered the baron a choice. Either he interferes in the trade in wax, letters, and needles, and then he is responsible for everything that has been done, or he withdraws from it, and then he will be judged for what his people have done without his knowledge. The baron said he was not ready to answer here and now. The abbess said that the church would give him a day to think it over, and a place to pray. Eleanor agreed, and said that she would not sign anything that day, except one thing: a marriage promise. and she signed a promise that promised a kinship with the house that held the road to the sea. By evening, it seemed that everything was under control. But the night brought something else. A man came to the market with a cart of candles. He offered them one by one and asked for immediate payment. A boy was running around the crowd, tugging at people's sleeves and whispering that the canopy over the city shops would have burned down if the wind had been stronger. Alice, who had come to the market to buy some coarse cloth, smelled the same bitter smell as she had smelled in the chest. She saw that the wicks of this merchant's candles were slightly gray and seemed to have been rubbed down. She told the city guard that the candles should not be allowed into people's homes. The guard laughed. Alice snatched a candle from the merchant and broke it in half. A thin thread came out from inside. It was dusted with powder. The boy ran away. The merchant tried to hit Alice. Martin, who was standing by the well, managed to shield her with his body. He was punched in the ear, fell down, got up, and squeezed the merchant's hands so hard that he groaned. The people around them laughed at first, but then they saw that the wax was dirty, and their laughter turned to screams. The merchant was taken to the city judge. The merchant said that he was just a cart driver, and that the goods had been given to him by a man with a buckle at the baron's house. It was too straightforward, as if done on purpose. Eleanor realized that someone wanted to make everything rough and loud in order to disrupt the council. During the night, someone tried to set fire to the canopy at the entrance to the council hall. The canopy was doused with grease and wicks. Alice removed the canopy and extinguished it with water from a barrel. She burned her palms, but did not retreat. Martin raised the alarm, and Hugo sat all night at the tables where the letters lay, keeping his hands on the seals. He said that if anyone approached, they would leave sweat. In the morning, there was no sweat on the seals. This was strange, because there are always curious people at night. So this time the curious were afraid. At dawn, the baron's men arrived. They reported that the baron had fallen ill and asked to postpone the conversation. They spoke too evenly. The abbess said that illness does not come on schedule, but prayer will still take place. Eleanor quietly ordered Martin to watch the road and see if any strangers were coming. Martin said that the water in the river was calm and that there were no traces of boats on its surface. But on the far bank, he found a fire that did not give off any heat. This meant that no one was sitting by the fire, but that it had been lit as a sign. Martin understood where the detour would be and posted 2 city guards who knew the fords there. He told them to listen not to the water, but to the birds. If the birds flew up silently, it meant someone was crawling, and if they flew up noisily, it meant they were walking upright. In the afternoon, the second council meeting began. The towns brought their charters, the monastery brought a list of arrears, and the merchant brought a loan receipt. Eleanor placed on the table a plan of the road network that the carpenters had made for the construction of bridges. She intended to link the city's demands to their obligations to repair the roads. She knew that if she gave rights without obligations, everything would collapse. She decided that obliging the cities to maintain the bridges would give them a reason to protect the roads. She announced that the Treasury would allocate grain to those who had suffered from last year's cold spell, but would receive a percentage of future duties in return. She spoke briefly. The barons listened, some agreeing, others frowning. The merchant in the expensive cloak disappeared somewhere. The manager said he had gone to look at the warehouses. Eleanor felt uneasy. If this man turned out to be a pawn of others, her plan with the cities would collapse. But by evening, the merchant returned with 3 people, elders whom no one had invited. He said that they had come at his request and were ready to sign the loan agreement immediately. He became the outsider who intervened with a single decision and shifted everything to a new plane, not with a sword, but with a receipt. In the commotion, Alice noticed a man near the treasurer's chest who often hung around in the shadows of the bar. He was holding a candle and holding it up to a crack in the wood. She shuddered because it was a sure sign that someone was looking for a draft. The man was looking for a place to let the smoke out. Alice approached and asked through a third person what he was doing. He said through an acquaintance that he was counting the cracks so he could fill them. She asked him to show her the wax. He gave her a piece. She broke it and saw a gray coating. She went to the judge and said that this man's wax was bad. The judge replied that now was not the time. Alice got angry, grabbed a log, and pressed the candle against it. The wax gave off black smoke. The judge nodded and ordered the man to be tied up. It was an everyday scene that turned into a thriller for a moment. Everyone saw how, right next to the bread and salt, they could hide a fire that would burn the agreements. In the evening, Hugo brought a small leather book to the Queen's chambers. He said he found it in the detainee's clothes. The book contained copies of letters written in his hand. Hugo did not hide his eyes. He said he should have spoken up earlier. He said that this man knew everything about him and used his fear of his father as an excuse. Eleanor took the book and said that fear was a poor helper. She told Hugo to go to the abbess. The abbess said that the church would give him peace and work where he would write not for fear, but for truth. That night, Eleanor wrote 3 letters. The first was to the baron's wife. She wrote that she had proof of the affair, but she was not seeking to bring shame upon them. She asked the wife to understand that the truth was necessary for peace. She promised not to publicly disrupt the order of the household if the wife herself could keep her husband from taking the worst steps. The second letter was to the cities. She wrote that their requests for rights had been heard, but that rights required responsibilities regarding bridges and fares. The third letter was to a merchant. She wrote that the loan would be accepted, but he must protect the roads from robbery not on paper, but with his own people. She said that if he refused, his word would be empty, and he would lose the future market. She knew that his strength lay in the future he himself was painting. At that moment, Martin stood by the wall, feeling the coldness of the stone. He remembered how they laughed at him and how he fell by the well. He looked at his hands and realized that during those days he had held more than just reins. He held the fate of letters that could turn the house upside down. He smiled quietly and went to walk around the woods. He made a wider circle than he was told to because he trusted the earth, not words. He noticed a hoof print without a spike and realized that someone was hiding. He came out onto the path and saw a small scarf swaying on a branch. It was a sign used by shepherds to convey messages. He memorized the knot and returned. By morning, there was commotion in the baron's camp. The servants said that their master had gone to confession. The abbess said that this was a lie because she had been sitting in the church all night. Eleanor realized that the baron was trying to leave to join his people, and that words would be followed by force. She ordered the loggias to be opened and the people to be let into the courtyard. She said loudly, so that everyone could hear, that the barons could come with their people and leave with their people, but they could not take the seals of others from the hall. She placed the city elders, who were not afraid of the barons because they had their shops and workshops behind them, at the tables with the seals. She moved the treasury aside and left only one scroll in plain sight, the marriage vow. By midday, the baron's wife arrived. She entered without her retinue, accompanied only by 2 women. She said that her husband had left without her permission, and that one very old buckle was missing from the chest where she kept her buckles. She asked the abbess to show her the mark. The abbess showed her the buckle that had been found in the monastery. The baron's wife cried quietly and said that the truth could no longer be kept under wraps. She recognized Hugo as her husband's son. It was a difficult scene, but it brought clarity. After that, they decided to make one last attempt at a settlement. Eleanor announced that she was ready to sign a general peace agreement, whereby the cities would receive rights and obligations. The monastery would receive control over the candle trade. The barons would receive clear limits on jurisdiction and taxes, and the crown would recognize marriage contracts as the main instrument of union. She said that all parties would take an oath, and whoever broke it would lose the right to court at the royal court, and would be subject to the courts of the cities. This was a blow to those who were used to resolving issues by force, but it gave support to everyone else. The baron did not appear and sent a man in his place who tried to read a long list of grievances. He spoke of lineage and honor, of old privileges, and how the new order would ruin the nobility. The towns replied that without roads, there would be no noble income. The abbess said that candles would now be measured according to the monastery's table, and that anyone who brought fat under the guise of wax would pay double alms and spend the season at work. A merchant in an expensive cloak stood up and said that his people were ready to guard the bridges and fairs. He promised to keep track of every last coin and open the books for inspection. He said that his profits would be visible when carts carrying grain and salt crossed the bridge. The barons smiled, but there was fear in their smiles. They felt that the world was not going according to their plan. At that moment, Martin entered the hall. He spoke calmly, but his voice was heard by all. He said that he had seen the baron's men outside the city trying to cross the swamp, and that they had lost a horse. He showed them a leather knot taken from a branch. He said that this knot meant an attempt to send a message to the shepherds, to raise the alarm. He added that the shepherds refused and led him to the path where the townspeople were standing. He said that those people were unarmed but stood firm because they knew that their bread depended on it. This scene, simple and crude, suddenly made Martin noticeable. 3 elders approached him and shook his hands. One of the knights quietly said that this messenger was holding up better than their young men. Meanwhile, the Baron approached the city with a dozen loyal followers. He was counting on confusion, but the townspeople, the monastery steward, and 2 knights loyal to the queen stood at the gates. The Baron's wife came out onto the walls and said that her husband would not enter until he gave his word. The Baron laughed and said through his servant that he was going to confession. The abbess replied through the messenger that the church would not let him in without repentance for the deeds she knew about. The Baron realized that he would have to go to the hall and play someone else's game. When he entered, Eleanor did not delay. She placed the buckle, Hugo's book, and the letters from the cities on the table. She said that here lay the 3 foundations of the world: recognition of truth in the home, recognition of rights in the cities, and recognition of duty to the future. She added that his house could remain large if he renounced bad people and accepted the rules. She did not demand humiliation. She demanded a choice. The Baron looked at his wife, at the buckle, and at Hugo. He said he did not recognize his son. His wife replied that she did. The abbess said that the church recognized the fact. The cities said that they did not care whose son he was, that roads were important to them. The merchant said that the queen's word and the baron's signatures were important to him. At that moment, the baron realized that his usual methods, flattery, bribery, fear, did not work here. He said through clenched teeth that he would sign, but demanded that his people not be tried in the city court for old cases. Eleanor replied that the past concerned only 2 things: candles and letters. They would pay for the candles in silver and work for the monastery. Everyone who wrote the letters would be held accountable. Hugo stood up and said that he was ready to answer for his actions and work for the monastery for as long as they said. The monastery nodded. This was a blow to the Baron because he lost his leverage over the young man. A peace treaty was signed. It was unequal for the proud, but fair for those who carried carts through the mud. The cities received the right to choose their elders and the duty to repair bridges. The monastery received the right to measure candles. The crown received recognition of marriages as the main form of union and the right to a separate tax from fares, which would go toward roads. The barons received clear boundaries within which they could judge, but could not interfere with trade. The merchant received a promissory note for a loan and a return receipt from the crown. Martin received the task of leading the children of the nobility along the roads so that they could see the real land, not maps. Alice, a position at the treasury, where she was to check seals and fabrics. Hugo, work at the monastery, and the right to return to court when he himself felt ready. It seemed that everything had settled down. But a week later, in the morning, A simple basket of bread and 3 small jugs of oil were placed on the threshold of the queen's chambers. It was a gift from grateful people, as someone had written on a scrap of parchment. It seemed like a normal thing. But Alice noticed that the seal on one of the jugs was slightly indented, as if it had been removed and replaced. She asked that the jugs not be touched and ordered a bowl of water to be brought. She dropped a drop from one of the jugs into the water, and the water became cloudy. In the other 2, it remained clear. She said that crushed grass had been added to the oil. It was a new attempt at domestic violence as simple as breakfast. Eleanor ordered someone to find the person who had brought the basket. The cook said that a boy had left the basket. The boy was found at the gate. He said that he had been given bread and told that if he put the basket at the door, he would get more. He cried and said he would never do it again. Eleanor ordered that he be fed and sent away. She said that the adults should be held accountable, and the child should only remember that you should not leave someone else's oil at someone else's door. Through this simple incident, everyone understood how easily evil creeps into everyday things. Therefore, the treasury began to keep a register of gifts. The monastery kept a register of candles, and the cities kept records of people who had traded at the fair in the last month. A painstaking order emerged, one that did not like noise but loved precision. This infuriated the Baron, but he had signed the peace treaty, and now could not break what he had signed. Time passed. The road to the sea came to life. The marriage announced by the Queen cemented an alliance that severed the former chain of influence. The Baron's people initially tried to grumble, but without sustenance, they quickly resigned themselves. The merchant maintained the bridges and wrote the bills. He did not deceive. Craftsmen from the city went to fairs and brought back salt and wine. Martin rode with them, showing them the fords where the water had become unbearable during the flood, and teaching them to read the wind. He was now greeted as a man who not only delivered letters, but also kept the roads alive. He was given a new horse, and the old one was left in the stable as a memento. He did not boast, but the knights began to listen to him, because he knew what they did not, where the earth steps when it does not want to hold a hoof. Alice sat in a cold little room with ribbons, wax, and fabrics. She checked every seal. Her fingers were no longer rough because she rubbed them with oil, but white marks from her previous work remained in her knuckles. She counted the balls of thread and refused those who brought strange wax. At first, people complained, but then they got used to it. She became a person whose gaze was worth its weight in silver. The treasurer grumbled at first, but then began to ask Alice for help, not because she loved her, but because she saw the benefit. Hugo lived at the monastery and wrote cleanly and quickly. He compiled a collection of letters that young scribes now studied, which did not allow the meaning to be confused. He wrote evenly, but every time he picked up the buckle that was sometimes shown to him, his hand trembled. He knew that his place was no longer with his father, who did not want to recognize him, but with the truth that recognized him. It was not easy, but it was straightforward. One winter, the Baron sent a letter asking for a reduction in the duty on timber transport because the snow had delayed smelting in his blast furnace and his men were freezing. Hugo read the letter and said that it was written without the usual flattery. Eleanor replied that she would reduce the duty for a month if the Baron provided people to clear the road and open accounts for the timber. The Baron agreed. He understood that now they were speaking to him in the language of business, and that became clearer to him than the language of deceit. A year later, a wandering craftsman who repaired bridges came to the castle. He said that in a distant parish, a merchant who gave loans had built a warehouse where grain could be stored until spring without mold. He said that this changed everything, because now there was no need to sell cheaply in the fall and die in the winter. He said that the Queen knew how to make small things add up to big things. These were simple words, but they were clearer than any hymns. All this was not a fairy tale about a miracle. It was calculation, patience, and the ability to see people. Marriages became alliances. Letters became swords. But the swords cut not flesh, but the bonds of habit. People who had been despised became pillars of support. Martin, who had been considered blind to words, turned out to be the one who heard the earth. Alice, who had been considered insignificant, became the measure of others' seals. Hugo, who had been kept on a leash, chose his own path and became a voice that people trusted. In the evening, when the last sheet was taken to the archive and the candles burned with an even light, Eleanor went out onto the gallery. Below was the courtyard. There, wet cloaks were hung out to dry, bread was divided, and the price of salt was debated. She stood and thought that victory was not a cry in the square or a seal on a grand document. Victory was when there was enough bread in winter, when a letter arrived without a bloodstain, when a daughter married not out of envy, but for the sake of the road her child would see. She knew that tomorrow there would be more letters, more requests, and someone would bring another basket of bread. She was not afraid. She had Alice, Martin, Hugo, the abbess, the merchant, the cities, the bridges, and simple arithmetic. More time passed. One spring day, an old man came to the courtyard carrying a horn with a seal. He said he had come to plead for his grandson, who had been caught at the market with bad wax. He said the boy did not understand what he was doing. The judge said that was no excuse. The abbess said that the boy would work at the monastery candle factory until he could tell good wax from bad with his eyes closed. Alice said she would teach him and make sure he didn't cheat. The old man bowed. He said his grandson wasn't evil, just stupid. They replied that stupidity wasn't permanent if there was order around him. In the evening of the same day, a messenger from the Baron arrived at the gate. He brought a small bag and a note. The bag contained silver coins, and the note said that the Baron was paying his debt for the candles that had once come with dirty wicks, although at that time he had not yet admitted his guilt. He added that peace was more profitable than pride. It was strange to see this from him, but it was right. Peace was maintained not by miracles or fear, but by the fact that everyone had their place. The barons had clear boundaries, the cities had the right to choose, the monastery had the duty to measure, the merchant had an honest book, the messenger had the road, the laundress had the seal, and the scribe had the word. And the queen had a duty. She saved the legacy of children and conducted politics more wisely than generals. She knew that noise would always be replaced by new noise, and order would always be replaced by new habits. Many days after the council, news came from a distant port. Two families, who had long argued over a salt storehouse, had come to an agreement. They signed the exchange not with spears, but with a dowry. The dowry was small, but it contained a map of the bridges built during the year. Attached to the map was a letter stating that the agreement had been signed in memory of the peace concluded under the Queen. This letter was passed around and reached the laundry room. Alice read it and smiled. Her fingers knew how to break tape, but now they held the paper gently. When winter came, the roads held firm. At the fair, there were rows of candles, and each one burned evenly, without soot. Martin led the boys along the river and showed them where the ice was solid and where it cracked, even though the surface was smooth. Hugo wrote a set of rules for city clerks. The abbess compiled a book of wax measurements. A merchant opened a new warehouse where grain did not turn black. The baron sent a sack of flour to the monastery kitchen, and no one made a big deal out of it. This season, it became especially clear that power is not a loud cry, but a network of small connections where everyone knows their place. Eleanor knew how to knit such networks. She taught her children not to seek glory in tournaments, but to keep peace on the road. She told them through a story that marriages should be built like bridges, so that not only warriors, but also carts could cross them. She said that letters should be written not for the sake of threats, but for the sake of clarity. She said that low rank did not mean low intelligence, and that it was time for low intelligence to rise every day. So one year ended and another began. Nothing miraculous happened, but a clean candle burned in the chapel. The bridge did not collapse, and the bread did not run out. The barns smelled of grain, the seals contained only honey, and the letters contained only words. People remembered and laughed differently now, not at Martin, but with him, when he told how the board showed the water, not at Alice, but thanking her for stopping the bad candles, not at Hugo, but nodding to him when he taught them to write briefly and clearly. And if anyone asks how the Queen outplayed the barons, the answer is simple. She did not wait for a miracle and did not curse her enemies. She built marriages like bridges, letters like swords, and people like pillars. She found those who were not counted and she gave them a place in the heart of the kingdom. And then hearts beat more evenly, and hands stopped reaching for other people's seals. This is justice, which does not fall from the sky, but grows from the earth.